Alright, before we jump in, this story is about Cassia Selwyn, a student caught in the middle of old, pure-blood politics, buried family secrets, and a legal machine that should never be allowed near Hogwarts. Expect tension, sharp dialogue, powerful old families, and Professor McGonagall doing what she does best, standing between a child and anyone foolish enough to think they can claim her. No spoilers, but this one feels less like a school mystery and more like watching someone pull the floorboards up under Wizarding Society. The House of Blood. Chapter 1. The Instrument in the Wall. The parcel lay on Minerva McGonagall's desk as though it had every right. No larger than a hardback book, it was wrapped in plain brown paper gone stiff with age. The address had long since faded, but the seal's impression remained pressed so deeply into the fibers that the paper seemed to remember the hand that had made it. She had cut the string herself. Even then, the knot had resisted, as if offended by interference. She stood over it with her wand in hand, watching the exposed corner of parchment within. The office was quiet except for the mantel clock and the faint crackle of the fire, absurdly cheerful for such a day. Rain tapped at the high windows. The room smelled of smoke, old paper, and the lemon drops Dumbledore had left in a glass dish beside the inkstand. He sat in her visitor's chair with one long finger against his knee, looking at the parcel rather than at her. That alone made her wary. Well? Dumbledore adjusted his spectacles. Candlelight flashed across the lenses and hid his eyes. It is, at the least, trying hard not to be a forgery. Minerva gave the parcel a look that would have stripped paint. That is not reassuring. No, only accurate. She drew her wand over the exposed seal. Finite incantatem. Nothing happened. She tried again, sharper. The parchment gave a tiny, stubborn shimmer and remained exactly as it was. Dumbledore's mouth twitched. A charming refusal. Minerva straightened. It is warded against ordinary verification. Indeed. She touched the seal with the tip of her wand. The wax was dark red, almost black in the firelight, stamped with a pattern she recognized only in fragments, the sort that belonged on vault doors, old agreements, and documents drafted by men who had expected the world to remain obedient to their signatures. The seal did not warm beneath her wand. It waited. She withdrew her hand. Founder era? At least. Dumbledore leaned forward, his chair creaking. He did not touch the document. He rarely touched anything first if he could help it, which was one reason people underestimated him and later regretted it. The form is old. Not a school notice, not a ministry circular. A trust instrument, if I am not mistaken. Minerva looked at him. You are rarely mistaken. A comfort to us all. She snorted and opened the packet fully. The outer fold gave way at last, but only because the seal seemed to permit it. The parchment inside was heavy enough to make the desk complain when she laid it flat. Lines of cramped script crawled across it in black ink, faded to sepia in places, then dark again where magic had renewed the letters. Marginal seals sat along one edge like watchful eyes. There was no title at the top, only a line of legal Latin so formal it looked bullied into existence by committee. Dumbledore murmured, "Oh dear." Minerva's eyes narrowed. You recognize it, a little. Enough to dislike it. That, from Albus Dumbledore, was warning enough. She read on. The text was dense, built to make sensible people surrender and sign whatever followed. She did not. Her lips moved once or twice as she picked through the clauses. References to wardship, to lineage obligation, to educational custody. Hogwarts appeared again and again, but not as it would in a memorandum or decree. The school was treated as a living house with duties of its own, and certain communities within it as entities to be maintained under trust for reasons of preservation. She looked up. This is not a prank. No, it would be in poor taste. She scanned lower. Her wand hovered over a clause written in a finer hand, almost tucked beneath an earlier line as though meant to be missed by impatient eyes. The words shifted when she looked at them, then settled. A confidentiality provision. It did not merely request secrecy, it enforced it. Disclosure beyond the named notice procedure would trigger a binding consequence under the instrument itself. Minerva's mouth tightened. Tiresome. Dumbledore gave her a look of sympathy. I suspect the original drafter intended deterrence. Then they succeeded. For a moment there was only the rain and the hiss of the fire. The parchment seemed to occupy the whole desk. She turned one page, then another. There were signatures, or the ghosts of them, and a list of formal witnesses she had not yet reached because the handwriting had become more ornate and more maliciously small. Then she stopped at a section marked with a narrow red line. "What is it?" Dumbledore asked. Minerva read it twice before answering. Her voice came out clipped. "The trust activates only in disputes over wardship, lineage obligation, educational custody, and preservation of a named house community." Dumbledore went still. The twinkle had vanished from his eyes. "That is specific." "It is worse than specific. It is prepared," she read on. The clause defined the circumstances under which trustees could petition, and the petition had already been filed. Her finger tracked the line again, slower this time. "By the old gods," she said, with no heat in it, only hard disbelief. "They have named present students." Dumbledore did not answer at once. Minerva looked up sharply. "You know more than you are saying." "I know," he said, and there was nothing playful in his tone. "That I do not know why this has surfaced now. I know enough of the structure to take it seriously. I know enough of the law to wish I did not." That was as near to confession as he ever came without pressure. It did not improve her temper. She turned the parchment towards him. "Read this." He rose and came round the desk with the care of a man approaching something that might bite. His robes brushed the carpet. He bent over the page, and Minerva watched his expression alter by fractions as he followed the line she indicated. "Ah," he said at last. Minerva's eyes sharpened. "Ah?" He straightened, one hand lifting to his beard. "I had hoped, for everyone's sake, that this clause had gone extinct. That is not an answer." "No," he said, with a dry weariness she heard too seldom to mistake. "It is the nearest thing I can safely offer in your office, under the terms of the instrument." Minerva stared at him, then looked back to the parchment. There, beneath the larger clause, was a second reference in a clerk's neat hand. One name was Cassia Selwyn. She had not imagined the earlier mention. The petition named her plainly. Beside it, in the same line, was the current student identified as witness and subject to the petition. Minerva read the student's name once, then again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less intolerable. They did not. A child in her school. A child still expected at lessons, at meals, at evening roll call, while this antique machinery crept into motion around them. Her jaw set hard enough to ache. So that was the shape of it. Not rumor, not a speculative nuisance sent by Owl to unsettle the school. A live instrument. A petition already in motion. Cassia Selwyn named. The student named. Hogwarts named. She set her hand flat on the desk beside the parchment, careful not to touch the active seal. "This is a petitioned trust instrument." "Yes." "With a confidentiality enforcement provision." "Yes." "And it names Cassia Selwyn, along with the student concerned." Her voice had gone cold enough to frost glass. "So we are not dealing with abstractions." Dumbledore folded his hands again, more to stop them doing anything rash than from calm. "No." "Who filed it?" His gaze remained on the page. "That section is further on, and I would rather not guess before we must." A sensible answer. She resented it anyway. Minerva gave the parchment another hard look, as if severity alone might make it vanish. It did not. The seals stayed intact, the ink stayed dark, and the names sat there with all the modesty of a noose. "Can you break it?" she asked. Dumbledore's answer came after the smallest pause. "I do not think so. Not directly, and not without discovering, perhaps too late, what else it is tied to." That was honest, which made it worse. Minerva lowered her wand to her side. The rain tapped at the windows. Somewhere below, a door slammed in the corridor, and the castle answered with a faint shudder through the floorboards. "Then we shall learn," she said. Dumbledore's gaze rested once more on Cassia Selwyn's name, then on the line naming the student beside her. Brief. Grave. He reached for the bell on her desk, then stopped before ringing it, his hand hovering over the brass handle. "Minerva," he said. "For the moment, no one else must know this has arrived." She looked at the shut door of her office, which had seemed secure a moment ago and now did not. Then back to the page, to Cassia Selwyn, to the student named with her, to the old seal listening in its silence. "On that," she said, "we are agreed." His fingers closed on the bell without sounding it. The seal on the parchment gave a faint, dry crackle, as if in approval. Minerva disliked that more than she could have said. She pulled the document back towards her and turned the next page with the edge of a ruler rather than her fingers. "If the filing section is further on, we read it now." Dumbledore inclined his head. Carefully. "I had not intended to do it recklessly." "No," he said. "That is generally my department." Under other circumstances, she might have spared him a look for that. Not now. The next page was worse. Denser script, more cross-references, a column of names partially obscured by a fold of parchment that seemed reluctant to flatten. She did not force it. The confidentiality clause had already shown enough temper to discourage experiments. Her eyes caught on the procedural language instead. Notice, standing, interim custodial restraint, school obligations pending review. Pending review. Not immediate seizure then. Not yet. The instrument had not come to carry the child off in the night. It had come to bind the school's hands while older powers decided what preservation required. A thin, hard thread of relief ran through her, made no gentler by the anger braided with it. The last page of the abstract lay under Minerva's hand like a live coal. It took very little to make her skin prickle. The clause named no child outright, only a house community. And yet the names that mattered had begun arranging themselves with ghastly neatness. Slytherin House, Preservation Review, Current Student Witness, Current Student Subject, Cassia Selwyn. She read the line again, as if the ink might have corrected itself. It had not. Dumbledore had gone quiet beside her desk. He stood with his hands folded before him, mild as a man waiting on tea, except for the way his gaze remained on the page. The spectacles low on his nose made him look like someone peering through a shop window at an object he had no wish to buy. Severus Snape had not moved from the hearth, where the fire threw weak copper light across the sharp planes of his face. He wore the expression of a man who had reached a bad conclusion some time ago, and was merely allowing the others the courtesy of catching up. Minerva set the parchment flat. "Cassia Selwyn," she said. "A Selwyn. That ought to have bought her a wider berth than this." Snape's mouth thinned. "In certain circles, Miss Selwyn's surname appears to have become an inconvenience." "That is a polished way of putting it." "It is the only sort I am prepared to offer." Dumbledore's fingers touched the arm of her chair, then withdrew. "Which circles, Severus?" Snape did not shift his eyes. "The sort that keep their opinions behind silver sugar bowls and old portraits. They have been speaking of restoration for weeks, perhaps longer. Lineage duties, house continuity, the usual rot dressed in ceremonial language so fools may mistake it for law." "Names," Minerva said. "No." It was not refusal in the ordinary sense. Worse than that. He left the word there, blank and immaculate, as though the matter had been shut with a latch. Minerva held his gaze. He had always managed to look as if he were doing everyone in the room a favor by existing in it. She had never trusted that quality, which was why she sometimes trusted the results of it. "You have sources," she said. "Of course." "And you are keeping them to yourself." "Until I am satisfied they will not be paraded before the wrong pair of ears." Dumbledore made a sound that might have been amusement in gentler times. "Severus does possess a fondness for discretion, Minerva. It is one of his less conversational virtues." "One of his more irritating ones, you mean?" Also that. Snape's lip moved by the smallest margin. If it was not a smile, it had the same chilly economy. We are all consoled. Minerva ignored him and bent again to the abstract, tracing the lines with one forefinger until the script broke into an old legal shorthand she could not at once untangle. The petition does not speak of expulsion, she said. It speaks of preservation review. A prettier phrase for a harder purpose. Dumbledore lowered himself into the chair opposite her desk. The movement was careful, unhurried, as if he meant the furniture no offense. It is also the sort of phrase that can survive a hearing, he said. If they are clever, they will want the school to seem obstructive. One rash intervention, one public scene, and the matter becomes tidy from their point of view. Tidy, Minerva repeated. Unfortunate, but yes. The ministry is always more comfortable when the ink has the decency to look calm. Her mouth tightened. He was right. And that was the worst of it. A loud refusal, a dramatic confrontation, some grand display in a corridor, and the trustees would have exactly the spectacle they needed. Hogwarts would be painted as defiant, sentimental, hiding behind children instead of procedure. The school had survived worse than paperwork, but only by not making itself easy to condemn. She looked back at the names. Current student witness, current student subject. Witness to what? She asked. Dumbledore's eyes remained on the page. The twinkle had vanished entirely. That is what I should like to know. Snape folded his arms. If the witness is current, they will already be under pressure. If the subject is current, they may already be watched. The trustees do not bother with abstract inconvenience when a practical one is available. That is a cheerful thought. It was not meant to be. She read on, slower now, and found the detail beneath the detail. The abstract identified the subject by name, Cassia Selwyn. There was no mistaking it. Her surname stood there in black ink with the blunt confidence of a family crest, and yet the surrounding language treated her not as someone protected by it, but as something to be examined under it. Minerva felt the absurdity first, then the anger. Selwyn. One of those old names that open doors, or used to. A name that should have made any advocate tread carefully. A name that, in the mouths of the wrong people, might do the opposite. She is a pureblood, Minerva said, or near enough for their purposes. Why would they touch her at all? Snape's gaze flicked once to the parchment. Because a name is useful only until it is not. Because some families are respectable only so long as no one asks after the ledgers. Because a girl's surname is a pleasant thing to admire when one has no wish to notice the branches beneath it. Minerva looked up sharply. That had come too close to something, and he knew it. He knew she knew it. His face gave nothing away, but his hands had gone still at last, long fingers resting against his sleeves, as though he had said more than he meant to. You know something else, she said. No doubt I know several things. Severus. He regarded her with a look so cool it might have been poured. Old pureblood houses have been whispering of restoration because they believe law can be made to bless nostalgia. Some are frightened. Some are eager. Some are merely foolish enough to think they will be spared if they nod in the right direction at the right time. I have heard enough to know the noise is real. I have not heard enough to hand you a clean map. Dumbledore steepled his fingers beneath his chin. And if you had? Snape's eyes shifted to him at last. Then I would still want to know who placed the petition, who ensured the abstract was circulated, and which clerk was paid to keep the draft in a private drawer until it could be made difficult. The room seemed to contract around that. Even the fire gave a thin crackle, as if it disliked being mentioned by implication. Dumbledore's face remained gentle, but Minerva knew the set of his mouth too well. He was already thinking several moves ahead, which was another way of saying he disliked all of them. You are suggesting, he said, that this is not a solitary effort. Snape inclined his head. I am suggesting that no one bothers with a legal cudgel of this size unless there are hands prepared to pass it on. Minerva tapped the parchment once. Then our immediate concern is practical. Who among the students is in danger before the trustees act? Cassia, certainly. The witness, whoever that is. Any Slytherin child with a name in the wrong old books. And perhaps any child who happens to be standing too near them, Dumbledore said. He had that maddening gentleness on him again, as if they were discussing weather and not the possibility of students being removed from their own house under color of law. Then the gentleness thinned, and the harder thing beneath it showed. We must not answer with panic, he said. Not yet. If we rush, they will have the pretext they seek. Obstruction, interference, a school refusing lawful review. Minerva drew herself up. And if we do nothing? Dumbledore looked at the abstract for a long moment. Then they advance by paperwork and call it peace. No one spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked with irritating confidence. Somewhere in the castle, a distant stair changed position with a heavy groan, and the sound passed through the study walls like a complaint. Minerva folded the parchment into precise thirds. Her fingers were steady. That was something. Can we challenge the standing of the petition? She asked. Possibly, said Dumbledore. If we do it clumsily, we validate it. Of course we do. The law is never simple when simplicity would be useful. Snape's eyes narrowed a fraction. The law is simple. People make it ugly. She shot him a look, but he had already turned back to the fire as if the remark had been no more than an observation about rain. Dumbledore rose and came to stand beside the desk. He did not touch the parchment at once. That, too, was like him. He preferred to look reluctant to interfere when, in truth, he was measuring every line of a thing. Cassia Selwyn, he said at last. I had seen enough of her file to know that her name alone would not protect her. Apparently, I had not seen enough. Minerva watched him. Something in his tone set her teeth on edge, some thin thread of regret drawn taut beneath the calm. Do not begin apologizing in riddles, she said. It wastes time. A ghost of amusement touched his face and vanished. Quite right. We need the time. He turned the abstract, bringing the witness line back into view. His fingertip rested there. Find out who the witness is, he said, and keep Cassia Selwyn out of sight of anyone who thinks a surname settles ownership. Minerva's head came up. Ownership? His expression did not alter, but the word hung in the room with a weight the abstract itself had only implied. Enough people have begun speaking as if children may be sorted into inheritance and evidence, Dumbledore said. I will not have them encouraged. Snape's gaze sharpened, though whether in agreement or warning she could not tell. Then you had best decide how far you mean to go before the trustees ask you to prove it. There it was, the true edge of the matter. Not outrage, not even danger, but timing. One wrong move, and the school would be dragged into a hearing before they had facts enough to defend a child without exposing another. Chapter 2. The First Petition. The Blood Court occupied a chamber below the ministry that had clearly once been meant for something more sober, or at least less damp. The stone walls were too clean for comfort, the sort of clean won by relentless polishing rather than air, and the lamps along them gave off a pale green light that made every face look pickled. At the far end, behind a long table draped in green baize, the trustees sat in a crescent of black robes and silver pins. Their quills were already moving. Minerva took her place without invitation. Cassia Selwyn stood to one side of the central mark on the floor, a narrow ring of inlaid brass scoured bright by centuries of official feet. She had gone still, which was often what frightened people did when they had decided movement would cost more than it gained. Lucius Malfoy stood opposite her, immaculate as a display of knives, one gloved hand resting on a stack of papers. Percy Weasley sat a little below the trustees' table, badge on his chest, jaw set so hard he might have been part of the furniture. A witch in slate robes crossed to the chamber's center, carrying a lacquered case under one arm. She set it on a side table with the care of someone handling an object designed to take offense if mishandled. Minerva recognized the ministry seal on the clasp. Official ritual equipment, then, separate from the parcel that had arrived at Hogwarts and separate from the trust instrument itself, which could not lawfully be opened in her office. Different tools for the same job. The witch opened the case. Inside lay a shallow silver basin, 2 narrow knives with horn handles, lengths of white thread wound on ivory bobbins, and a packet of powdered salt tied with blue ribbon. Everything looked certified, counted, and counted again. Lucius glanced at the arrangement and then at Cassia, as if the sight pleased him. "Madam Chair," he said, voice smooth enough to tile a floor with. "The petition is narrow. It asks only that the court acknowledge an old obligation and permit the customary test of continuity. We are not asking for transfer nor discipline, merely recognition where recognition is due." Due. The word sat there, neat as a button. Percy leaned forward. For the record, the petition cites the Preservation Trust's founder-era clauses, amended through authorized modern procedure, and requests provisional standing only. The ritual set up before the court is solely for the supervised preliminary rite, already authorized on threshold grounds. It does not extend to broader review beyond the file access specified in the order. Minerva kept her face still. Threshold grounds. File access specified. The language of limits, always produced just before someone tested how far they would stretch. "One likes to hear the law spoken properly," Lucius said. "It saves time later." "It saves nothing if it is applied selectively," Minerva said. His pale eyes moved to her. "Professor McGonagall, the continuity of a house is not selective. It either survives or it does not." Cassia made a small, sharp sound, not quite a laugh. She looked at the brass ring and not at him. "You have no right," she said. Lucius turned his head a fraction. "The court will decide rights, Miss Selwyn. That is what courts are for." There was the trouble with men who wrapped themselves in procedure. They could make the air seem tidy while doing something ugly in perfect order. Percy cleared his throat. Minerva could hear the strain in it, the effort it took him not to look anywhere but his notes. "Miss Selwyn, you have been advised of your right to answer questions relevant to standing, lineage obligation, and school custody. If you decline to assist the court, the record will note your refusal." Cassia's mouth tightened. "Then note it." Minerva saw Lucius's fingers tap once on the papers. Not impatience. Calculation. The chair of trustees, a thin witch with watery eyes and a voice too mild for the room, folded her hands. "The matter before us is limited. The house in question has long been subject to custodial interpretation, where lineage obligations intersect with school residency. The trustees require a preliminary right to determine whether the student's file ought to be reclassified under temporary review." Reclassified. A child spoken of like a drawer. Minerva stepped closer to the brass ring. "A file is not a child, and a review is not a finding. You have already obtained enough to justify caution. You do not need more to start a precedent." "On the contrary," Lucius said, and now there was chill under the polish. "Precedent is precisely what prevents disorder. If a house has become a refuge for concealed obligations, the trustees cannot be expected to avert their eyes merely because the implications are inconvenient to the school." "Inconvenient," Minerva repeated. "Is that what you call turning a child into a test case?" Percy's ears reddened. He looked as though he wanted to say something sensible, and had discovered sense was a poor shield. "Professor, the order before the court is for temporary review status. The petition does not, at present, authorize removal." "At present," Minerva said. He swallowed. "At present." The witch by the side table had already drawn the basin forward. The silver caught the green lamplight and threw it back in hard little flashes. Minerva turned to Cassia. "If there is any record, any adoption, legitimization, wardship note, any family instrument I can use, now is the time." Cassia's eyes flicked up at last. They were steady, which was perhaps worse. "I told you what I could." "That is not the same as what I need." "No," Cassia said. "It is not." Minerva held the girl's gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. Something was being kept back there, not from shame, not exactly, but with the kind of stubbornness that could ruin a perfectly good argument. Maddening. Also, she suspected, the only reason the child had not yet been eaten alive by all the polished people in the room. The chair lifted one hand. "We proceed?" Lucius inclined his head. "If the court is ready." Minerva said, "I object." "That has been entered," Percy said with the strained patience of a man reciting weather reports to a flood. "I object again. A preliminary rite performed before full contest of standing gives the petition an advantage no child can fairly answer." "The rite is supervised," Percy said. "The court has already limited the scope." "Limited," Minerva said, looking at the basin, the knives, the thread, and the people who believed that was enough. The witch opened the salt and scattered a thin white line round the brass ring. It settled on the stone like frost. One of the trustees coughed into a handkerchief. Lucius drew a slim parchment from his stack and laid it before the chair with the air of a man setting down a reasonable bill. "The school may of course provide objections to the file being opened under review. It will be noted that access is temporary and restricted to trustees and authorized officers. Compliance matters, if necessary, may follow." There it was, tucked in neatly beside the ritual. Access, compliance. As if one child's blood might be used to prise open a corridor and then widen it into policy. Minerva could feel the whole chamber leaning towards the easy version of events. It was the oldest trick in the ministry's cupboard. Make a theft look like administration, and half the room would thank you for the paperwork. "Miss Selwyn," the chair said, "do you consent to the supervised preliminary blood claim rite under temporary review status?" Cassia went still again. Then she said, "No." A murmur ran round the table, swift as a draft under a door. Percy looked down at his parchment. "Refusal is noted. The court may nevertheless authorize the rite where standing is disputed, and the petitioner has shown prima facie legal basis." "Prima facie," Minerva said. "How convenient." Lucius folded his hands. "Convenience has little to do with it, Professor. Continuity does." The chair exchanged a glance with the other trustees. Minerva saw the movement, small and practiced, and knew the shape of what was coming before it arrived. That was the worst of these rooms. Not surprise, but recognition. The moment one understood that the decision had been walking towards them for days in polished shoes, and all this speech had only been the courtesy of letting it in by the front door. "The court authorizes a provisional blood claim ritual," the chair said, each word falling into place like a clerk's stamp. "The student remains in school custody pending review. The trustees are granted access to the school file for the duration of that review, subject to ministry supervision, and limited to the threshold materials already identified. Any wider house compliance measures are held in abeyance." Held in abeyance. Not denied, not stopped, merely placed on a shelf within reach. Percy wrote the order down with painful care, his quill scratching like a beetle over glass. He did not look pleased. He looked like a man trying to keep faith with a machine by feeding it the correct parts, even as it took someone's hand. Lucius gave a slight bow, to the chair, to the room, to himself perhaps. Minerva's hand had curled round the edge of the table before she noticed it. She forced it loose. Anger would not help Cassia now. Precision might. Memory certainly would. Every word spoken here would have to be carried upstairs, set in order, and turned back on them before they could pretend this had been harmless. Cassia did not move. The only sign of anything at all was the white line of salt at her shoes, bright against the dark hem of her robe. She looked younger for an instant, and then not younger at all, only cornered, and determined not to show them where it hurt. The witch opened the lacquered case wider and lifted the basin into place. "Bring the student forward," the chair said. Cassia's fingers closed once round her sleeve. Then she stepped over the brass ring, and the basin caught the light between them like a piece of winter water. Minerva moved with her until the salt stopped her. It was not much of a barrier, a pinch of powder on stone, but the law had always preferred its violence tidy. "I am here," she said. Cassia did not look round. "I know." The Slytherin common room was quieter than the rest of the castle, though only by Slytherin standards. The fire muttered in the grate. Green shaded lamps made every face look a little spectral. On the nearest sofas, boys who ought to have left had merely lowered their voices to what they imagined passed for discretion. Minerva stood by a pillar and took in the room without seeming to. Dark carved panels, Serpents worked into chair backs and table legs. The long windows showed the lake pressed close beyond the glass, green and dim as old bottle bottoms. Sensible students had found reasons to vanish when she arrived. A few remained with the fixed, unhealthy interest of witnesses at the edge of a carriage wreck. Draco Malfoy had not moved far. One hand rested on the back of a chair, as if posture alone could suggest ownership. Cassia sat opposite him at a narrow table near the fire, straight-backed, still enough to suggest long practice in making herself smaller than danger. Minerva took the empty chair beside Cassia, near enough to keep the conversation contained, near enough that the girl was not trapped between a Slytherin boy and the room. Cassia kept her gaze on the table. Lamplight caught a worn silver ring on one finger, rubbed thin at the edge. Inherited, perhaps, or salvaged. "You said your mother concealed a branch of kinship," Minerva said. "That is not a small thing, Miss Selwyn. I require more than hints." Cassia's mouth tightened. Her face looked schooled into composure and held there too long. "It is all I have," she said. That is often what people say when they have decided exactly how much to give. Minerva folded her hands. "I am not asking you to perform repentance. I am asking what the trustees believe they have found." Draco gave a faint sound of contempt, though it lacked its usual polish. "They think they can turn old parchment into destiny," he said. "Give them a seal and half a family tree and they will stage a whole production." Minerva turned to him. "And you offer this from concern for the school, Mr. Malfoy, or because you object to strangers rummaging through ancestral cupboards?" His jaw shifted once. "It is not amusing, Professor. If this spreads, it will not stop with her." That, at least, rang true. Minerva had little patience for his manner, but she paid attention to fear when she heard it. Fear made people careless. Sometimes it made them honest. Cassia's fingers tapped once against the table edge. Then again. "My mother kept it out of the family books," she said at last. "Not all of it. Enough left behind to live on, if anyone came looking. She said there was an old duty attached to it, not something properly spoken of for generations. She made certain no one in the house could pass me over through the usual channels." "Could," Minerva repeated. Cassia lifted one shoulder. "Would have tried if they had known." The fire cracked. Across the room, someone stopped pretending to read. Minerva kept her voice even. "What duty?" Cassia looked towards the window, towards the black-green water beyond it. "I do not know its full shape," she said. "Only that it belonged to the house, not to a title. My mother used to say those things were harder to bury. She broke the records apart before anyone else could ask the wrong questions." Draco's expression sharpened. "You make it sound as if she robbed her own line." Cassia turned to him then, properly. "She kept me from being used." The words landed hard. Draco's mouth closed. For a moment he looked younger, stripped of the lacquered disdain he wore so naturally. Minerva leaned back a fraction. "And yet the trustees knew enough to petition." Cassia said nothing. "Who told them?" Minerva asked. "I do not know." Too quick to be empty, too smooth to be true. Draco flicked a hand in irritation. "That is not useful. If a house secret has been dug up, you say who had the shovel. Otherwise everyone starts eyeing everyone else's dead relations." "That," Minerva said, "has long been a favorite pastime in certain drawing rooms." His ears colored. He looked offended that she had noticed. Cassia's mouth twitched to spite herself, then settled. "You think I have not considered that? If I speak of one part, it drags another behind it, then another. My mother knew exactly how much to leave me, enough to keep the trap from shutting cleanly." "And now?" Minerva asked. Cassia's hand closed over something in her pocket, a folded square of parchment by the shape of it. She drew it out at last, but kept it shut. "Now someone from a great house sent me instructions before the hearing." Minerva went still. "Instructions?" Cassia nodded once. "Not by owl, by parcel. It came to the dormitory with my initials on the wrapping. No sender, only an old crest in the wax." The change in Draco was slight but unmistakable. Color left his face in a single controlled retreat. "What crest?" he asked. Cassia glanced at him in a way. "You know I am not saying that here." Minerva held out a hand. "The contents, then." Cassia placed the folded parchment on the table without opening it. "It said I was to appear calm. It said not to answer one question unless it was put in a particular form. It said the trustees would present the matter as if they had only just discovered me. That was false. It said I was to remember who had already read the old records." Minerva looked at the parchment, at the softened crease where it had been opened and closed more than once. "And you followed these instructions?" "I considered them," Cassia said. "Not a denial. Useful." Draco gave a short, mirthless laugh. "How reassuring. A private note arrives and we are to assume it means rescue? It could just as easily be guiding her into a deeper hole." Cassia looked at him. "You think I do not know that? Then why keep it?" The sharpness in his voice surprised even him. He lowered it at once, but Minerva had already heard the crack beneath it. "Why not burn it? If that enters the record, half the old houses in Britain will be dragged into the light. Mine included, if they start asking what else has been hidden. Reputations do not survive this sort of thing. They decay." Minerva watched him closely. There was the true shape of his alarm, not mere distaste for scandal, though he had that in abundance. He understood precedent. Name one old family and the next could be summoned by resemblance, by obligation, by some clerk's appetite for pattern. The law loved a tidy chain. Cassia pressed her fingers flat to the tabletop. "I kept it because it proves they were not guessing." Minerva turned back to her. "Explain." Cassia drew a measured breath. "The note referred to the hearing before it was announced. It named the petition's shape. Not the exact wording, the shape. It warned me the trustees had already matched my name to my mother's private records. Those records were not in the school archive. They were not in the ministry roll. Someone in a great house had seen them, or had access to them, and passed the matter on before the petition was filed." The room seemed to contract. Even the fire sounded farther away. "You are certain?" Minerva asked. Cassia gave her a tired, offended look. "I am not a fool, Professor. The seal was old, the sort houses use when they wish to pretend they are not sending messages at all. The parcel arrived 2 days before the ministry owl. 2 days. Enough time for a paper to leave an archive, cross a desk, become a whisper, then a petition, all dressed as sudden revelation." Minerva's thoughts moved quickly, fitting pieces together and refusing easy comfort. Family archives, ministry procedure, a private warning. Someone with access and someone else with motive. Not chance, not a single hand. "No," she said. "They did not act alone." Draco looked at her sharply. "That is not good news." "It was not meant to be." Cassia's shoulders loosened by a hair's breadth, as if hearing the thing named had taken some of its force. "Then you see why I did not surrender the letter at once," she said. "If I name the sender, the wrong house hears it. If I do not, the trustees go on pretending they stumbled over me." Minerva kept her eyes on the folded parchment. It was a small thing, no larger than a handkerchief, yet it lay there with the menace of a knife set down within reach. "Did it say anything else?" she asked. Cassia hesitated. Minerva watched the calculation pass across her face. Not trust, but arithmetic. "It said," Cassia replied carefully, "that if I wanted any chance at all, I was not to let the trustees separate me from school authority after the hearing. Not for a private interview, not for transport, not for signatures taken in haste." Minerva's spine hardened of its own accord. Draco swore under his breath. So that was the plan. "Perhaps," Minerva said. "Or one plan among several." Cassia gave a small nod. There was one more line. It said some of the men at the table would speak as if they were deciding a matter of record. I was to remember they were deciding possession. Silence followed. Not the lazy hush of a common room, but something colder. Minerva reached for the parchment at last and laid 2 fingers on it without unfolding it. "You will give this to me." Cassia looked at her hand, then at her face. "Will you put it in the record?" "Not tonight." Draco exhaled, not quite relief. Minerva rose. The movement sent a ripple through the room. The lingering spectators found urgent interest elsewhere. She tucked the folded note into her sleeve. "Listen to me, both of you," she said, keeping her voice low. "From this point forward, neither of you goes anywhere alone if a trustee, clerk, or ministry messenger requests it. If anyone attempts to remove Miss Selwyn from school protection without my consent, they will." Chapter 3. Exceptions Buried Deep. The restricted archive had been built on the assumption that anyone sensible would surrender before the third partition. Minerva might have admired the principle if it had not so often been enlisted in the service of concealment. The room beneath the library was all iron shelving and narrow aisles, the air held close and dry by old charms that made parchment complain at the least disturbance. Lanterns burned behind green glass and washed the brass labels in bilious light. The titles had been chased so fine into the metal that they looked less engraved than fretted there by a patient insect. Hermione stood at the first partition with a sheaf of reference slips braced against one arm, doing her best to resemble an assistant and not, as Minerva feared, a conspicuously gifted student in a room where gifted children could become useful to the wrong people. At the far table, Severus Snape was bent over a ledger so old the leather had faded to the color of weak tea. He did not raise his head when Minerva came to stand beside him. "The shelves are divided by date, authority, and because our ancestors were lunatics, blood-standing," he said. "One is meant to find that civilized. I shall try not to enjoy myself too much." His mouth thinned. "If you are expecting a clause obliging enough to announce itself as the answer, you will be disappointed." I had not come here in a hopeful mood. Hermione appeared between the aisles with a volume hugged to her chest. "Professor McGonagall, I think this register cross-references the Charter Index, but only if the later copy was collated after the 1374 revision. The spine has been labeled incorrectly." "Of course it has," Snape said. "Accuracy would have ruined the atmosphere." Hermione ignored him and offered the book to Minerva. The spine read, "De custodia domus et obligationibus sanguinis," in a hand so cramped the letters seemed reluctant to be seen together. An early copy, then. Minerva opened to the marked page and found dense Latin under 3 layers of annotation, each hand correcting or disputing the last. Hermione leaned nearer without touching the parchment. The first notes are founder-era formulae. The second layer clarifies procedure. The third is either an objection or a warning. "Often the same thing," Minerva said. They worked in strained quiet. Hermione read where the script had decayed into guesswork. Minerva translated. Snape, from across the table, supplied legal nuance without looking up, as though the text offended him too deeply to merit eye contact. The archive yielded itself in fragments. A preserved house, a custodial community, a duty of continuity. Then, in a clerk's severe margin hand, the first useful word, exceptio. Minerva bent over the page. "Again, Miss Granger." Hermione adjusted her glasses with one knuckle. "Where continuity is threatened by diminution of lawful issue, the House may receive exception through recognized collateral, adoption with an approved wardship, or legitimized issue recorded by 2 witnesses and the standing keeper." Snape looked up then. "The old families were always eager to rename necessity as principle." "That is what principle is for in these texts," Hermione said before she could stop herself. It would have been impertinence from another child. From Hermione, it was merely exact. Minerva turned the page. Another record, then another. The same language recurred across centuries in different inks and different tempers. A matron's decree preserving a cadet branch after plague. A post-war settlement acknowledging a son taken in by an aunt and entered under the house seal. A legitimization instrument signed after a duel had left the direct heir dead, and the family, in the ministry's view, inconveniently thin. The name Slytherin appeared with unpleasant frequency in the margins, beside lines struck through and rewritten. Not one inviolate chain of descent, then, but a web of repairs, substitutions, and legal inventions polished into tradition by age. Minerva felt her expression harden, not at the existence of the records, at the ease of them. All that rhetoric of purity, and whenever a line grew brittle, the powerful had simply reached for another branch, another witness, another child who could be made to fit. She turned to Snape. "You knew where to look." He closed the ledger with deliberate care. "I knew what would not be left in the obvious places." "That is not an answer." "It is the one available." Hermione, who had been following a note with her eyes and keeping her hands still by force, said, "The language shifts when the house is described as politically endangered. It stops speaking about purity and starts speaking about preservation." Minerva checked the line. Hermione was right. The legalists had not been fools. Opportunists, yes. Fools, no. Snape's gaze moved to the shelf behind her. The annexes. Minerva found them hidden behind a false divider, as though the compiler had wished to discourage casual readers and forgotten that archives were built for exactly the sort of mind that noticed such things. There were exception cases there, one after another, each less convenient than the last. A child born after a legitimizing settlement, accepted because the direct line had failed. A daughter adopted by a widowed matriarch and entered under the same seal as her dead brother's heirs. A nephew outside the main blood, recognized after petition when the family vaults would otherwise have passed to a rival branch. Each ended with the same phrase, ut domus servetur, so that the house may be preserved. Minerva read the final annotation twice. Not law as justice, law as maintenance. Not sanctity then, but convenience in ceremonial dress. She had seen that trick often enough in wizarding society. Seeing it pinned to the school's own records made her want, for one bright instant, to put her fist through the table. Said Hermione, in the tone she reserved for books that had personally offended her. "That is profoundly dishonest." "Yes," Minerva said. Snape inclined his head a fraction, bitter agreement without surprise. Hermione glanced towards the door and lowered her voice. "If this is what the trustees mean to lean on, then the supervised right for Cassia Selwyn is not separate from the petition at all. It is the procedural bridge. They have already named her in the petition as witness and subject. The preliminary blood claim right lets them say they are testing continuity under existing authority, not creating a new claim from nothing." Minerva looked at her sharply. Hermione colored at once but held her ground. "I am not suggesting they are right," she said. "Only that it explains why they asked for a supervised preliminary right and not more. It keeps the matter pending while making it look established." "And because Miss Selwyn has refused consent," Minerva said, "they will be all the more eager to describe the right as merely custodial and preliminary, as though that makes her refusal a procedural inconvenience rather than the central fact. The trustees have authorized only the supervised preliminary form. Whether they may press for it over objection is precisely one of the questions now in dispute." Snape's fingers tapped the ledger once. Bad law becomes dangerous the moment it sounds orderly. "I know," Hermione said, quieter now. Minerva returned to the annexes. One marginal line had been struck through and restored in a different ink. Another bore a clerk's note. "Where the claim is not of blood alone but of standing, the house's interest prevails over the individual objection." She read it again, then found the related entry, then the earlier copy, then a fragment older still carrying the same phrase in rougher Latin. The chain ran backwards, each record propped on the authority of the last. The pattern was plain enough now to sicken. Slytherin House had not survived by remaining pure. It had survived by becoming flexible whenever someone powerful required its survival. Adoption when the line thinned. Legitimization when an inconvenient child became too useful to discard. Collateral heirs when proper heirs died, vanished, or refused to cooperate. The law had bent around the house every time the house mattered to those with enough standing to preserve it. Minerva laid the volume flat with more care than she felt. The leather struck the table with a muted thud. "So," The trust is not inventing a power. It is reaching for an old habit and dressing it as inevitability. And hoping no one distinguishes precedent from appetite, Snape said. Hermione's face had gone set and pale with thought. Then the hearing matters more than the right. If they can frame even an attempted preliminary result as confirmation of a recognized exception, they gain momentum before anyone argues the underlying authority. And if she continues to refuse... She has every right to refuse, Minerva said, more sharply than she intended. And no one in this room will speak as though her resistance were an obstacle to tidy procedure. Hermione straightened at once. No, Professor. I didn't mean... I know what you meant. Minerva let the edge leave her voice. That is why we must be exact. The petition is active. Her name is already in it. The trustees will try to use that named status to make the right seem like administration rather than coercion. These records tell us how they will argue. They do not entitle them to succeed. She looked from one to the other. This goes no farther than this room. Miss Granger, you are here to sort references and nothing more. You will not pursue this line of inquiry, and you will not involve the student named in the petition. Of course not, Hermione said at once. Then, after a beat, if anyone asks, I was correcting shelf labels. That would be implausible, Snape said, even for you. Hermione glared at him. I can be discreet. I am aware. It is one of your more alarming qualities. Under other circumstances, Minerva might have permitted herself the ghost of a smile. Instead, she turned one more page and stopped. In a register of settlements from the early post-founder period, beneath a seal half broken by time, a clerk had written in the margin, Exception preserved pending review of wardship claim. Preserve the child until hearing. The words were plain, administrative, almost gentle. Minerva's hand moved before she could stop it, hovering over the line without quite touching. Preserve the child until hearing. Not protect, not release. Preserve. An object kept intact while others decided what might be made of her. For a moment the archive fell away, and she saw the records office had all the charm of a vault that had once been told it was important and had never recovered from the compliment. It occupied a long, low chamber beneath the Wizengamot, where the air stayed close and cool however many lamps were lit. Rows of shelving stood behind iron grills, each shelf marked with brass plaques, each plaque bearing numbers that meant nothing until one had been forced to care about them. The lamps cast a pale, steady glare that made the ink on the ledgers look tired. Every drawer that opened, every page that turned, seemed to complain. Minerva stood at the counter with her hands folded behind her back and listened to Percy Weasley explain, for the third time, why a file could not be fetched directly. It is not a question of reluctance, Professor, Percy said, chin a fraction too high. It is a question of proper indexing. The ledger series you request is cross-referenced under 3 custodial headings and 1 legacy trust index. If we simply pull the wrong bundle, the chain of custody is compromised. We are not discussing a corpse, Mr. Weasley, Minerva said. No, Professor, which is precisely why the chain of custody matters. At the adjoining desk, Arthur made a small sound into his hand that might have been a cough and might not. He was bent over a stack of request slips, sleeves rolled to the elbows, reading shelf references as though they were a puzzle worth solving. Every so often he glanced from the clerk's indexing chart to the shelf plan and traced a finger down a column with patient concentration. Minerva could not help noticing that while Percy had spent 10 minutes defending process, Arthur had already found the route through it twice. The clerk, a thin witch with severe spectacles, slid another form across the counter. If Madam wishes to review precedent holdings relating to educational custody claims, she must indicate whether she seeks active petitions, closed petitions, or sealed references pending review. Sealed references, Minerva said. Then we require a second clearance. I have clearance. You have departmental clearance, Percy said, with injured patience. Sealed references require archival dispensation under Rule 17, Subclause 4. And who grants that? The archivist of record, or a deputy authorized in writing. Arthur was still studying the shelf plan. There isn't a deputy listed for that section, he said. Not since the last archivist retired, which was 20 years ago, and, judging by the note, the post has been temporarily held in abeyance ever since. Percy's ears reddened. If the post is in abeyance, then the proper course is to petition for restoration, not to improvise. I wasn't suggesting improvisation, Arthur said. Only that the office appears to have forgotten to appoint anyone to say no in the approved manner. The clerk pressed her lips together. Minerva had the distinct impression this was not the first time the place had been defeated by its own paperwork. She set the request slip down before her temper got the better of her. I need precedent holdings from the last 70 years. Blood claim petitions, private settlements, any case where a house preservation clause was translated into custodial language. Translated, Percy repeated, as if the word itself were suspect. Converted, Minerva said. I do not prefer either. The phrasing should be exact. Anything less invites challenge. Arthur looked up. Minerva's challenge is rather the point, Percy. Percy straightened his collar, which did nothing for him. My point is that if the records are obtained irregularly, any evidential value may be disputed. If the trustees' side can argue contamination, they will. And if they can argue it, they will succeed long enough to make matters worse. Minerva gave him a level look. You sound as if you have sat through the sort of hearing that teaches one the shape of delay. His mouth tightened. I have sat through enough hearings to know what happens when a clever person decides the rules are an inconvenience. That, at least, was honest. Minerva inclined her head and turned back to the clerk. Then let us proceed inconveniently, but within the rules. The witch examined her for a moment, then made a note in a ledger so large it looked bred for the purpose. You may inspect the index cards while your request is processed. How long? 3 hours, if no objection is lodged. Percy gave a small, satisfied nod, as though 3 hours were a reasonable gift from heaven. Arthur's expression suggested he thought heaven had less to do with it than the forms implied. The index room lay beyond a narrow arch and a second locked grille. It held cabinets of card drawers, each labeled in cramped script. Some bore old departmental names, others newer custodial categories with the neat, bloodless air of committee invention. Arthur accompanied Minerva as far as the rules permitted, then paused with his fingers on the back of a chair. I can't fetch the sealed sets without a writ, he said, but I can tell you which drawers have been misfiled. There's a habit here of putting the awkward things just where the searcher will assume they're not. Do not tell me you learned that from the ministry. Arthur's mouth twitched. From the ministry, from the twins, and from trying to find the right kettle in a house with 7 children. He pointed without flourish, only precision. That row there. Educational custody, modern petitions. The card behind the 4th tab is an old cross-reference. It's filed under preservation, but it points to wardship hearings after the amended statutes. Minerva took the drawer he indicated and slid it open. The card at the 4th tab was stiff with age. The writing had been amended more than once, each correction neat, each addition trying to sound as though it had always belonged there. She read the references one by one. House Preservation Clause, Continuity of Community, Educational Custody Review, Temporary Guardianship under Trust Authority. All the ugly little phrases lined up like cutlery. Here, Arthur murmured, placing a finger on a slip tucked behind the card. That one's a private settlement. It's been closed, but the index still names the school wardship issue. If you want to know how the old language became the new, that is probably the path. Minerva looked at the slip, then at him. You are being useful, Mr. Weasley. I should hope so. I am in the office, after all. From the doorway, Percy cleared his throat with the air of a man compelled to witness a breach of etiquette. Arthur, you are not meant to indicate material before it has been formally requested. Arthur did not turn. I haven't handed anything over. You have pointed. That is not prohibited. Percy looked as though he would like to argue and could not decide which regulation to use as a weapon. Minerva let them have their little duel of paperwork and opened the drawer Arthur had indicated. The first cards dealt with homes, estates, and inheritance disputes, each one dull as bread until one learned to read the legal language beneath the plain one. Then, with a small snag of card against wood, She came to a set of closed petitions from the late 40s and 50s. The names were familiar in the way old newspaper notices were familiar. Glimpsed once, never forgotten. Families had chosen silence. In exchange, the records had chosen neatness. A child claimed, a line verified, a hearing deferred. A matter of scandal resolved privately, a house community preserved. The phrase appeared again and again, steady as a metronome. No one had wanted the truth in the room if the outcome could be kept respectable. Minerva's mouth thinned. Respectability had ruined many things while keeping its gloves clean. She turned another card and stopped. The reference was sealed with a narrow strip of blue wax, stamped by a trustee mark she did not recognize at first. Beneath it, in a clerk's hand finer than the rest, was a notation to a maternal line linked to Blackthorn Hall. The line was not named in full. It was bracketed, cross-indexed, and marked for restricted review. A second hand, in different ink, had added a legal note beneath it, the sort a person might make while trying not to look at what they were writing. Compare precedent. Ritual exception accepted in case of disputed legitimacy, where maternal obligation attached to preserved house. Minerva read it once. Then again. The room seemed to go still around her. The cabinets remained in their rows. The lamps hummed overhead. Yet something had shifted. Another line, only half visible beneath the seal, caught her eye. The abbreviated mark of a trustee. Not enough to name, more than enough. The notation was not merely historical. It was dangerous in a present tense, carefully sanitized way. Someone now sitting in judgment had once depended on an exception perilously close to the one being used against Cassia Selwyn. So that was why this had been buried. Not because it was obscure, because it was useful. Minerva kept her hand steady on the drawer while her eyes moved over the notation again. Blackthorn Hall. Maternal line. Ritual exception. The word preserved sat there like a blade left on a sideboard. Behind her, Percy said, "If you are reviewing a sealed reference, Professor, you must note the drawer number before removal. Otherwise, the citation trail becomes incomplete."
Minerva did not look round.
"Mr. Weasley, if I note the drawer number and copy the reference exactly, will that satisfy your devotion to completeness?" "It will satisfy procedure." "Procedure," Arthur said, almost to himself, "has a great deal to answer for." Percy drew himself up. "Procedure is what prevents people from taking liberties with records they are not authorized to see." Arthur closed the ledger he had been consulting and rested both hands on it. "And silence is what lets them do it anyway." Percy's color rose again. "You are treading dangerously close to implying that the ministry should ignore its own safeguards whenever someone finds them inconvenient." "No," Minerva said before Arthur could answer. She turned at last, one finger still marking the card. "He is implying that safeguards become camouflage when they are arranged to protect only one side." Percy opened his mouth, shut it, then tried again. "If there is a defect in precedent, that is for a hearing to determine, not for us to decide in a records room." "Quite," Minerva said, "which is why I intend to bring the defect into the hearing before it is tidied away again." The clerk appeared in the doorway with a disc list.
Chapter 4. The Great House.
The house had built itself in layers of old money and older caution, a long, pale sweep of stone behind ironwork blackened by weather, with yews clipped so hard into shape they looked punished for growing. Minerva stood on the step while the wards tested the three of them in turn, then once more, as if the estate could not quite credit what had arrived at its gate. A cold thread of magic skimmed her wrists and the seam of her robe, paused at her concealed wand, and moved on. Wet gravel and box leaves scented the air. Cassia kept her chin high, nearly the only part of her that did. Remus, beside her, looked like a man invited to a funeral who had decided to be useful about it. He carried a slim portfolio under one arm. His other hand rested behind his back, empty and visible, which was either courtesy or a warning to anyone sensible enough to notice. Before they crossed the threshold, he had murmured, "Old houses prefer ceremony to argument. It saves them admitting they are often the same thing." A house elf in a gray tea-cloth tunic led them through a hall lined with portraits that had mastered the art of seeming harmless. One old witch in a bonnet turned her painted head as Minerva passed and pursed her lips so precisely that even the frame looked affronted. "Records room is below the East Gallery," the elf said. "Miss will not touch the red ribbons without asking. Master's rule." "Who's master?" Minerva asked. The elf blinked, as if the question itself were untidy. "House is master, Professor. Same thing when family is proper."
Cassia's mouth tightened. Her hand at her side curled until the knuckles blanched. Remus glanced at Minerva. "That," he said under his breath, "is the sort of phrase that keeps solicitors in work." The records room was cooler than the rest of the house, the stone damp in the corners. Tall shelves marched away beneath a low ceiling blackened by old smoke. Ledgers stood in ordered ranks, some in cracked green leather, others in calfskin the color of old parchment. Sealed envelopes sat upright in pigeonholes marked with crests and dates. On a narrow table by the window waited a brass lamp and 3 pairs of reading gloves laid out with almost insulting care. Care, but not welcome. Minerva went first to the table. One ledger had been left open, as though someone had been interrupted in the middle of an entry and expected to return. Beside it lay correspondence tied with a faded green ribbon. She did not reach for either at once. In old houses, the wrong movement could set an entire machinery of objection rattling into life. Cassia remained near the door. The ward light in the lintel had not fully faded. It cast a hard green wash over her face that made her look younger and more determined than Minerva suspected she felt. "Well," Cassia said too quickly, "is it here? Or have they salted the room with lies as well?" Remus set down his portfolio and drew on the gloves with care. "If they have at least kept them alphabetized. More than can be said for some ministries." Minerva gave him a brief look. He answered with the smallest lift of an eyebrow, as if to say that even now there ought to be some economy of tone. She turned the open ledger towards herself. Names, dates, wardship notes, marriage settlements, lineage notations in a crabbed hand that had bitten into the paper. One column for maternal claims, another for exceptions. Most entries were dull in the way bureaucracy preferred to be, until the dullness concealed a knife. Then she found the Selwyn folio. It was thinner than the rest, its spine repaired at least twice, the title written over an older one. Someone had wanted the family's business to look cleaner than it had been. Minerva opened it carefully. The first pages held what she expected: births, betrothals, transfers of property, a death noted in a hand too impatient for ornament. Then a blank page, and after it a notation in different ink, later by perhaps 10 years. She bent closer. Private recognition entered by ritual exception, following contracted squib marriage. Issue of Blackthorn Cadet Branch acknowledged for purposes of wardship and family obligation only. Name withheld from public register by request of House Principal. The words did not improve on a second reading. Not forgery, not gossip dressed as record. A line entered with the flat authority of something that had once needed witnesses. The Blackthorn name stood there in full, though the public branch had been trimmed away as neatly as a dead cane. Selwyn, Blackthorn, squib marriage, private recognition. She looked up sharply enough to stir the lamp flame. Cassia was watching her with the taut stillness of someone listening for a trap to spring. "What?" Minerva turned the page and found a small seal impressed in the margin, worn but legible. Not merely a family crest, but a legal mark. One of those old ritual stamps that still carried weight, because too many respectable witches and wizards had once agreed to pretend such things were administrative. Beneath it, in tiny script, the exception was named as binding under household custom and old blood obligation. Remus came to stand beside her, near enough to read without crowding. His expression altered by only a degree, but Minerva saw it. "Blackthorn," he said softly. "That would explain how a claim can be made through her mother's line, and why someone has worked so hard to present this as a simple purity question." "Simple," Minerva said, eyes on the page, "is rarely a word found in honest legal records." Cassia took one step forward and stopped. "Say it plainly." "Your mother was not a casual branch on the family tree," Minerva said.
She was the unacknowledged daughter of a Blackthorn cadet line. The house recognized her in private after a squib marriage. That makes the obligation real, in law, if not in the mouths of people who prefer their blood tidy on paper. Cassia's fingers flexed once. So she lied. Remus spoke before Minerva could. Not necessarily. She may have hidden it. There is a difference. Cassia's look was sharp enough to cut. A fine one. It matters, he said. Sometimes most to the person who hid it. That landed harder than comfort would have. Minerva saw him choosing each word and leaving the rest unsaid, refusing to spend sympathy where precision might serve better. Cassia stared at the ledger. The color had gone from her face, leaving it drawn and bright under the lamp. My mother told me nothing. If she knew, she told me nothing.
Minerva kept the folio half open, unwilling to lose the page. Or she thought she was sparing you. Cassia let out a short breath through her nose. By letting me become this? There was no answer worth giving. Minerva checked the seal again, then the margin. A second note sat beneath the first, written later and more hastily, as if whoever had added it had been troubled into carelessness. No public claim to be made, exceptions retained in family archive. Wardship obligations remain extant under the Blackthorn Compact. There it was. Not enough by itself, not the thing that would finish the matter, but enough to show the shape of the snare. Enough to strip the trustees' rhetoric to its frame. They had dressed this as continuity, preservation, noble duty, and here was an old family entry admitting what the loudest among them would never say aloud. Bloodlines had been managed, hidden, adapted, and blessed in private whenever it suited the house. Minerva felt the cold clarity that came before anger. The performance was brittle. Not wholly false, which was the ugliest part. Merely selective. The sort of truth old families prized. Remus folded his hands behind his back again. This helps Cassia, he said. But it also gives anyone inclined to malice a cleaner way to say she is what they accused her of being. Cassia looked at him. Claimable? Legally, yes, he said. Socially, they will call it whatever lets them sleep. For a moment, she seemed to draw inward, not shrinking so much as gathering herself at every edge. Minerva knew that look. A child deciding whether the floor would hold. The trouble was that this child had had to make such judgments too often. Then what good is it? Cassia asked. Enough, Minerva said, and heard the iron in her own voice. It shows they are not dealing in principle, only privilege. It suggests your mother's silence may have been shame, or protection, or both. It shows the trustees have built a grand argument on a rotten beam. Cassia's gaze returned to the page. And if I look at the rest? The question was barely above a whisper. Not cowardice. Worse. Courage with a cost attached. Minerva slid the ledger a fraction towards her, then stopped. Only if you wish it. Cassia stepped closer. The room seemed to narrow around her. The lamp threw the Blackthorn seal onto the paper in a dull red circle, as though the house itself had pressed a thumb there and meant to keep it. Then she stood very still. One hand lifted a breath above the open folio, not touching it. At last she lowered her fingers to the margin. Nothing flared. No ward snapped shut. Only the dry whisper of paper under skin. Cassia swallowed and turned the next page. The entries that followed were worse for being ordinary. A list of quarterly disbursements to an unnamed guardian. Notes on schooling deferred, then resumed. A line regarding temperament in a hand so cool it made Minerva's teeth set. On the third page, tucked into the gutter, a narrow slip of parchment had been folded twice and forgotten. Remus saw it at the same moment she did. Careful, he murmured. Minerva eased it free with gloved fingers. No curse answered. The slip bore no signature, only a date and a notation in the same later hand. Child not to be presented. Existing arrangement sufficient. House obligation may be discharged through maintenance of claimant line if ever required. Cassia made a small sound, not quite a laugh and not quite anything else.
Claimant line, she said. That is what I am then. No, Minerva said at once. The chapel had been built by people who expected stone to remember their names. Pale slabs paved the floor, worn glossy where generations had knelt or shuffled in Sunday boots. The walls rose in a narrow curve that sent every sound back a shade too neatly. No candles burned in the family vault itself. Only 2 witch lights hovered above the iron chest at the far end, washing the carved effigies in the niches with a green cast. The dead looked politely disapproving. Minerva approved of them for it. Cassia stood with both hands clasped behind her back, though the effort of keeping them still showed in the hard line of her shoulders. Since the folio had been opened, she had gone pale in a way Minerva disliked more than tears. Not theatrical, not weak. As if the room had taken something from her and left her staring at the space where it had been. Minerva held the trustee-certified copy in one hand. The parchment was stiff with seals pressed along its lower edge. The original had gone back into the chest under 3 old wards and 1 new ministry lock, because no one trusted a single copy where money, names, and children were concerned. The copy was what mattered now. Lucius Malfoy entered as though the chapel had been arranged for his convenience. He did not hurry. He did not need to. Witch light caught in his pale hair and turned it almost silver. His traveling robes were dark and severe, cut with the sort of precision that announced expense without admitting vanity. In one gloved hand, he carried a folded sheaf of ministry papers, held with the care one might give a legal notice or a venomous creature. His gaze moved over the vault, the chest, Minerva, and Cassia, and settled last on the copy in Minerva's hand. "Professor McGonagall," he said, "I am relieved to find matters proceeding without damage." Minerva did not return the courtesy. "Mr. Malfoy, if you have come to admire the stonework, you may do so from the doorway." His mouth tightened by the smallest degree. "I have come under lawful authority, as the papers will make plain." Cassia shifted her weight. Barely anything. Minerva saw it all the same. The girl was looking at the papers as if they might bite. Lucius turned just enough to include her without seeming to. "Miss Selwyn, you need not remain in uncertainty. The trustees have no wish to distress you further. Their concern is regularity. Yours, I am told, has been neglected for some time." That struck where he intended. Belonging withheld, then offered back in polished wrapping. Efficient. Cruel. Cassia said nothing. Her eyes flicked once to the chest, then to the copy in Minerva's hand, then away. "Regularity," Minerva said. "A charming word. You mean control." "I mean order." Lucius lifted the papers a fraction. "There is a distinction." "There is. People who profit from one often pretend it is the other." For a moment, the only sound was the old house settling around them. Beyond the chapel wall, rain tapped at a leaded window. Lucius let the barb pass. The record in the vault does not alter the obligations already recognized by the trustees. Private exceptions, however regrettable, do not abolish public duties. The house remains under preservation review. Miss Selwyn's custody therefore requires immediate neutral supervision until the final hearing. Cassia's fingers tightened behind her back. Minerva could see the muscle working in her jaw. "And who," Minerva asked, "was consulted before you decided that child would be better managed by your superiors than by the school she attends?" The trustees acted within their remit. Minerva fixed him with a stare that had sent generations of students back to their essays in silence. "Then they may defend that remit before the hearing officer. Not in a chapel with a frightened girl and a stack of parchment." His face stayed smooth, his voice cooled. "You may object, Professor. That is your habit. It is not the same as being right." He took one measured step towards Cassia, stopping at a scrupulously proper distance, as if he addressed a guest rather than a child whose life was being sorted by committee. "There is no shame in choosing what is best for you," he said. "A recognized name, protection, proper standing. A family who will not require you to plead for acknowledgement whenever you enter a room." Cassia's throat moved. Of course it would tempt her. The girl had been made to live on scraps of permission, and here was a man offering her a silver plate and calling it justice. Minerva had only the truth, and the truth was a harsher meal.
"The school will protect you," she said. Lucius looked at her then, and something in his tone turned clean and sharp. Will it? By scandal? By rumor? By a public contest over records the trustees have every right to interpret? By not handing you a child as though she were a file to be shelved? Cassia gave a short, broken laugh, more breath than sound. It vanished at once. She turned her face towards the chest, as if the old iron might offer a kinder answer than either of them. Lucius held out the papers. "Miss Selwyn, if you come with me now, the transfer will be handled quietly. Neutral quarters are prepared. You will not be left at the mercy of those using you to make a point." Minerva saw the trap at once. Neutral quarters. Quiet handling. The law in its Sunday coat, smiling through its teeth. Cassia looked from the papers to Minerva. For one bare second her face opened. Fear, hunger, shame, all of it plain. Then she seemed to bite down on whatever might have come out. She moved. Not towards Lucius, towards Minerva. The trustee's certified copy was still in Minerva's hand. Cassia reached with a quick, shaking snatch, caught the lower edge, and pulled before Minerva had fully yielded it. The parchment slid free with a dry rasp. Cassia shoved it into the front of her robes so fast the motion was nearly clumsy. Her hand came away trembling. Lucius's eyes snapped to the place where it had vanished. "Miss Selwyn." She flinched, but did not surrender it. Minerva drew herself up, ready to step between them, but Lucius had already unfolded the ministry papers with maddening calm. Red wax seals gleamed on the page. Authority had a smell to it, Minerva sometimes thought. Dust, ink, and the confidence that someone else would suffer the consequence. "Then we shall proceed properly," he said. "Professor McGonagall, be advised that Miss Selwyn is provisionally transferred from school custodial oversight to ministry neutral supervision pending final hearing and trustee determination. Service is effected now." He set the papers on the stone ledge of the altar with deliberate care. Minerva stepped forward and laid her hand flat over them before he could withdraw his. "You will not remove her from my presence without challenge." "I do not require your approval," Lucius said. "Only your acknowledgement." "That is not the same thing." "No," he said with a thin courtesy that made the word worse. "It is less convenient." Cassia looked from one to the other, and Minerva saw the cost of what she had done in the set of her mouth. No triumph in it. She had chosen, yes, but from fear into more fear. The copy hidden under her robes had not made her safe. It had only made her necessary. "Miss Selwyn," Minerva said, keeping her voice level by force, "stay where you are." Cassia nodded once, too quickly. One hand remained pressed over the stolen copy, as if she feared it might slip free and betray her. Lucius drew back a pace. "For the avoidance of doubt, I am not attempting physical enforcement before the rite concludes. The papers are served. Their execution is stayed until the rite is complete or formally contested. If you intend to contest them, Professor, I suggest you do so promptly." There it was at last, the hook set in plain sight. Minerva kept her hand on the papers. "I shall contest them before you have finished congratulating yourself." "I would expect nothing less." His gaze went again to Cassia's robes, to the place where the trusty copy lay hidden. Irritation showed now, faint but unmistakable, not because she had defied him, children did that often enough, but because she had done it badly, fearfully, and in a way that could not be dismissed as principle. She had made herself inconvenient to every side. Outside, the rain struck the chapel glass in a quick, angry patter. The witch lights above the chest trembled. Minerva did not look away from him. "You have served your papers. You have been answered. The rite comes next, and the custody question after. You will not conflate them in my presence." A pause. Then Lucius inclined his head, not in agreement but in recognition that the line had been drawn. "As you wish, for the next quarter hour." It was as close to retreat as she was likely to get. Cassia swallowed. If the right changes anything, Lucius cut in softly, then the hearing will become more interesting. Minerva heard the fear in the girl's voice and the satisfaction buried under his restraint, and her temper sharpened to a clean edge. Enough! The words struck the stone and came back harder. Silence followed. Cassia's breathing was shallow. Lucius stood composed beside the altar. Minerva kept one hand on the served papers and the other near her wand, with the old chest between them like a witness not yet finished speaking. Nothing had been settled. The law had been invoked, the challenge made, the child marked in ink and expectation both. Next would come the right, and after that the fight in earnest. Chapter 5. What the Law Will Admit. The chamber smelled of vellum dust and candle smoke, with a colder note beneath, old stone dragged too long from the dark. Minerva had noticed it the first time she came below the ministry carrying a question and a stack of records, and familiarity had not improved it. Brass lamps ringed the central table, their flames leaning inward as though listening. Percy stood at one end with his ministry badge pinned dead straight, fingers set beside a bundle of papers squared to the table's edge. Lucius Malfoy stood opposite, gloved hand resting on the back of a chair he had not chosen to use. Cassia sat rigid at Minerva's right, color high in her face, one hand pressed to her sleeve where she had hidden the trustee-certified copy she had taken from the tray upstairs. Dumbledore occupied the last chair, hands folded over the head of his staff as though he had wandered into a drawing room by mistake. The trustee's petition lay open between them. Percy cleared his throat. If the chamber is ready, we are confined to the question of whether the preservation clause authorizes custodial transfer upon proof of lineal obligation, not to broader sentiments regarding the school's character. Lucius's mouth shifted by the smallest fraction. How fortunate, Weasley, that you have remembered the rules at last. Percy did not look at him. The filed petition is admissible on its face. The ritual material has been certified. The subject student has not disputed her identity. Cassia lifted her chin. I've disputed plenty else. Miss Selwyn, Percy said with the air of a man addressing a difficult form, if you have a relevant legal objection, you may submit it. Minerva saw his ears redden. He had chosen his ground in the usual way, standing where the ink directed him and hoping conscience would not become an administrative complication. Lucius opened his hands. The trustees did not revive this matter from sentiment. They did so because hidden exceptions exist. Family concealments, quiet legitimizations, detached guardianships. Every one of them proves the need for oversight. If Slytherin House has been preserved by discretion, then discretion belongs with the trustees. There it was, clean, elegant, poisonous. Preserved, Dumbledore said, as if testing the word. His eyes rested on the petition, though Minerva suspected he was reading the room instead. An interesting choice. Lucius turned a cool glance on him. You approve, Headmaster? I approve of children remaining where they belong, Dumbledore said. I have not yet heard that this chamber's present use of law achieves that. Percy's fingers twitched on his papers. The chamber cannot rule on moral preference, only on admissible categories: wardship, custody, obligation, the preservation clause itself. Then let us look at the clause, Minerva said. The room shifted towards her. Even Lucius waited. She set a sealed record beside the petition. The wax bore the trustee's own stamp. This is the certified exception record from the trustee's archive, not the trustee's certified copy Miss Selwyn retained from the tray upstairs. She still has that one. This is the chamber copy, complete, indexed, and sealed through the trustee's office. Cassia's fingers tightened inside her sleeve. Good, Minerva thought. Keep it. Lucius's gaze fixed on the seal. You have been busy. I have been thorough, Minerva said. There is a difference. She broke the wax. The parchment inside was thicker than ordinary ministry stock and carried the faint, bitter smell of old copies, as though the ink had learned to defend itself. Names ran down the page in cramped lines. Not one or two, but dozens. Adoptions, reversions, collateral placements.
a legitimization buried under a married name, a maternal line accepted after a squib marriage, a guardian arrangement amended in blue ink, then green, then crossed through and approved again. Her jaw set as she read. Lucius saw enough to understand the danger. "I trust," he said, his voice light with contempt, "that you are not about to parade every family embarrassment in Britain merely to make a point." "No," said Minerva, "only the relevant ones." Percy bent over the page. "This material is highly sensitive." "It is," she said. "That is why it was hidden." "And yet it was kept," Dumbledore murmured. The sentence was mild. It landed like a blow. Minerva turned the page so Percy could see the notation in the margin, written in the same meticulous hand that had tried to tidy away the untidy facts of other people's lives. House to be preserved through continuity of community. Educational placement preferred. Family duty subordinate where necessary. She tapped the line. "There is your answer. Not extraction. Not custody in the sense this petition now pretends. Preservation of a house community within the school. The children were kept in place so the house might continue, not so trustees could pry them out again when a claimant found it convenient." Lucius's expression cooled another degree. "And the hidden exceptions? They prove the opposite of what you say," Minerva replied. "They were made because the house survived by exception, by discretion, by quiet recognition of obligations that could not be spoken aloud without harming the child at the center of them. That is not the same thing as turning students into bloodstock for transfer." The chamber gave a faint, unpleasant hum. The lamps brightened, then steadied. Percy swallowed. He looked at the paperwork as if it had betrayed him. "The categories remain awkward." "Categories are frequently awkward," said Dumbledore, "especially when people insist on forcing children into them." Lucius drew himself straighter. "You are inviting the chamber to endorse concealment." "I am inviting it," Minerva said, each word clipped and clear. "To reject your petition on the grounds that the preservation clause has been misread. If the old trust meant anything, it meant maintaining a house community within the school, not converting that house into a custodial channel for pure-blood claimants who believe lineage entitles them to possession." That struck home. She saw it in Percy's face, in the reluctant crease between his brows. He disliked being told the law had been used badly. He disliked it more when the proof came in neat columns under old seals. Lucius's hands went still on the chair back. "If the chamber accepts that construction, it narrows future claims." "Yes," Minerva said, "to individual wardship disputes, where they belong." Percy looked up sharply. "That would void the transfer order." "It would." Silence held a beat too long. Cassia did not move. She sat so straight she looked braced for impact, as though even now she expected someone to find a final line in the record that would let them lay hands on her and call it procedure. Percy drew a careful breath. "The chamber finds the trustees' petition insufficient for reclassification under the preservation clause. Cassia Selwyn's transfer order is void. Future claims against enrolled students are to proceed, if at all, as individual wardship disputes, and not as house-wide custodial presumptions." Lucius did not blink. "Noted." "It is more than noted," Minerva said. He gave her a thin, immaculate look. For the moment, she did not waste breath pretending this was victory entire. It was not. The framework remained. The blood law still sat on the books like a trap with velvet over its teeth. Cassia's name would be in every interested ledger by nightfall. There would be corridor whispers, invitations disguised as concern, old families remembering branches of relation they had neglected for years. Men like Lucius would not forgive being denied a mechanism merely because they had failed, this time, to dress appetite as principle. But the girl would not be marched out of Hogwarts under a trustee's seal. That mattered. Dumbledore rose first. "Then we have preserved what mattered." Lucius's eyes slid to him. "For now." Percy gathered his papers. His hand shook once. He would blame the parchment. "The order will be rescinded in writing." "See that it is," Minerva said. Cassia stood so abruptly that her chair scraped the stone. Every head turned. For one moment, Minerva expected anger, gratitude, some reckless declaration born of relief and humiliation together. Instead, Cassia looked at the open record under Minerva's hand, then at the doorway beyond the lamps. "Am I allowed to go back now?" she asked. The question landed harder than Lucius's arguments. Not, "Am I safe?" Not, "Have I won?" Only whether she was permitted to return to the ordinary life they had nearly let the law take from her. Minerva kept her voice sharp enough for the room. "Yes, Miss Selwyn, you are." Cassia gave the smallest nod, touched the fold of parchment in her sleeve to make certain it was still there, and walked to the door without looking at Lucius again. The chamber did not feel warmer after she left, only emptier. Minerva closed the record and laid her palm flat over the trustee's seal, as if pressure alone might keep the thing shut. "You will have copies made," she said to Percy, "with access restricted and names redacted where the ruling does not require them." Percy hesitated. "That is irregular. So was nearly handing a child over under a theory your own archive contradicts." His mouth tightened. "I will draft the order. You will draft it correctly." Lucius reached for his gloves, though he was already wearing them. "Enjoy your narrow reading while you may, Professor. Old law has a habit of expanding again when useful men attend to it." Minerva met his gaze. "And old families have a habit of calling appetite duty." A flicker, no more, in his eyes. Then it was gone. "Good evening." He left without haste, which was his preferred way of conceding nothing. Percy lingered only long enough to collect the petition and the dignity he had mislaid beside it. When he had gone, the chamber seemed larger and more tired. Dumbledore remained where he was, watching her. "You are angry," he said. "Yes," Minerva answered. "Good." She looked down at the sealed record beneath her hand. "We saved her this afternoon." "We did." "They will come back another way." "Almost certainly." Minerva drew a long breath and let it out through her nose. Anger sat in her chest like iron fresh from the forge. Useful, if one had the sense.